Alrighty, moving on now. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the show, tomorrow is what President Trump is calling Liberation Day. It's when the auto tariffs in Canada finally go into effect. And this has caused a lot of contention between President Trump and the Prime Minister of Canada. And it's also become a focal point ahead of the highly anticipated Canadian elections, which are going to be taking place on April 28th. And so I figured who better to talk about this and to really tell us the true story about these tariffs and to explain why there's such a protest from the left and, the left-wing party in Canada and also from the Democrats here in the United States, and why the tariffs are actually a good thing for not just the United States, but also Canada and the Canadian people. Joining me now to discuss is independent journalist Sam Cooper, founder of The Bureau. Sam, thank you so much for joining me on Loomer Unleashed. It's a pleasure to have you, and congratulations, because you're really shaking up the elections in Canada, and you're really shaking up U.S.-Canada relations with your intrepid investigative reporting. And I wanted to extend a full hour for you because there's just so much and it's so shocking. I can't believe that a lot of these reports that you're breaking and the information that you're uncovering as it relates to fentanyl trafficking and money laundering in Canada and how it all ties back into the U.S. economy and the tariffs. This should really be all over mainstream media news, and it's a shame that it's not. And so welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to have you.
Absolutely. It's so good to be with you, Laura. And I would just like to say I can break some news for your listeners. Last night after midnight, a Canadian politician running for Prime Minister Mark Carney, the Liberal Prime Minister, stepped down after allegations were raised that he had encouraged Chinese language news reporters, and it had been reported that his political rival on the opposition Conservatives, who is from Hong Kong, a Canadian citizen, could be turned over to the Chinese consulate for a bounty on that man. So yeah, you're right. It just shows the I would say the incredible penetration of Chinese infiltration in Canada. So this politician stepped down after my reporting broke the news Friday, and Hong Kong Canadians and democracy activists around the world put pressure on Canada's police force to investigate these allegations.
This is shocking. So basically what you're saying is that a candidate on the left side of the political aisle who is aligned with Mark Carney, who is now the interim prime minister filling Justin Trudeau's position since he resigned after being humiliated by President Trump. He's going to be our 51st governor, according to President Trump. We're going to have a 51st state here with Governor Trudeau. But what you're saying then is that this Chinese individual referred his political opponent for arrest to a CCP tip line and suggested that they should turn over a Canadian citizen to CCP authorities. That's what you're saying?
Well, I'll break it down a little bit because it's important. My reporting has shown that Chinese language media in Canada has been completely taken over by the Communist Party in Beijing. The Beijing operatives essentially control all there. And there's a lot of Chinese news outlets in Canada. In the United States, by the way, this should be happening too. But what happens is they get the local Chinese reporters to meet with agents, agree on how stories will be reported, what narratives to push for Beijing. And this is key to this story. This liberal candidate and sitting parliamentarian, Paul Chiang from the Toronto area, met with Chinese journalists exclusively in January, and he told them if his rival was elected, because his rival is under this illegal Hong Kong national security law, this liberal candidate said you could turn him over to the Chinese consulate and get your bounty of something like it's $1 million Hong Kong dollars, which is about $150,000 American. So absolutely egregious and shocking. Obviously, when I broke this story on Friday, a firestorm starts, and Mark Carney yet told Canadian media that he still had confidence in this candidate. He would not make him stand down, but the Canadian police were essentially forced to announce they will investigate. when a group disclosed that they wrote a letter. This is a, Hong Kong groups around the world said, look, Canada, you have to investigate this. So it's a shocking story, but I say that there's a much bigger story, and that is Chinese election interference across Canada. I broke that news, Laura, for the past two elections, and it connects, I believe, to Donald Trump's concerns that China has infiltrated Canada.
Well, China has also infiltrated the United States of America, and we have a lot of fifth column CCP networks here in the United States of America as well. This is something that I've been focused on exposing lately as well. There was a bit of a scandal relating to the Deputy National Security Advisor, who is Chinese, believe it or not, here in the United States of America, after the Signalgate controversy due to some investigative reporting and my report, which uncovered that his father-in-law ends up actually holds stock. His father-in-law has since passed away, but his father-in-law was one of the biggest shareholders in AsiaSat, which is the largest satellite company in China and the largest satellite provider in Asia. And so, long story short, it doesn't matter whether it's Canada or the United States of America, there is a growing trend of CCP infiltration, not just election interference, but also drug trading. And so that's what I wanted to focus on next, because if you pull up the tariff announcement by President Trump out of the White House from February 1st, 2025, it says fact sheet, President Donald J. Trump imposes tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. The extraordinary threat posed by illegal aliens and drugs, including deadly fentanyl, constitutes a national emergency under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Until the crisis is alleviated, President Trump is implementing a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico and an additional 10% tariff on imports from China. Energy resources from Canada will have a lower tariff of 10%. Some of your reporting also focuses on how the Canadian banks are being utilized by Chinese fentanyl manufacturers, and then that fentanyl is being transported across the border into the United States of America to poison and kill United States citizens. This is groundbreaking reporting, and there's been so much discussion about, President Trump is just trying to retaliate against Canada, and this is going to destroy our relationship with the Canadians. But really, what the media doesn't want to focus on is the extreme money laundering and drug laundering operation that is taking place, that is not just harming the lives and the safety of Canadians, but also of American citizens. And so what's the real story here, right? What is the real story? And do you think that the Trump administration is preparing to hold Canadian financial institutions accountable for laundering terrorist drug money? And should the media focus more on this instead of trying to, create this imaginary divide between the politicians here in the United States and the politicians in Canada?
Yeah, first of all, as a Canadian, I do think it's a hammer that's hitting a very serious problem. But the problem is that, good working Canadians will get hurt with broad tariffs. So I do believe, and I'm in contact with people in the American government, that the real concern here is that Canadian banks and financial institutions, that includes, government-run casinos, have turned a complete blind eye to the Chinese transnational triads that are running Western Hemisphere money laundering from North America. And so this includes, big Canadian banks being used for massive amounts. And when I say massive, I mean multiple tens of billions of dollars laundered through Canadian banks, hundreds of billions laundered through the connected Canadian real estate sector and casinos. And so it's a very complex financial system. If you can let me break it down for a second, look, everyone knows fentanyl precursors produced in China. They can't just ship out those pills because, of course, American law enforcement will catch that. They send the precursors into the west coast of Mexico and the west coast of Canada. That's the key here. They develop offshore production hubs. And so it's absolutely a concern that Canada has fentanyl super labs being run by the Chinese triads. We have Mexican cartels, including the Sinaloa. set up in, border cities, Vancouver, Toronto.
Working
But
with the CCP, right? Because everybody always talks about how, oh, it's just the Mexican cartels, which have since been designated as transnational designated terrorist organizations by the Trump administration. And so a lot of people, I think, don't really understand how the Mexican cartels work with Islamic terrorist organizations and also the CCP to transport fentanyl into the United States of America and also other parts of the world. They think it's just, groups like, the Mexican cartels and then the gangs from South and Central America, like MS-13 or Tren de Aragua, which seems to be the focus now of President Trump's deportation policy. But I think that we also need to have a very serious conversation about the amount of visas that we're giving to Chinese nationals and also the rate of Chinese illegal immigration into the United States of America, not just through the southern border, which is something I saw, firsthand when I traveled down to the Darien Gap in Panama, but also a lot of the Chinese illegals who are coming into our country are crossing in illegally through the northern border with Canada. And these people are working hand in hand with the cartels, as your reporting has laid out and exposed, to poison Americans. And you don't really hear the media talk about this. When you think of fentanyl importation, the first thing I think that comes to most people's minds is, Mexican drug cartels. But I think that when you maybe you could break down the ratio, if you have the numbers on this, who's bringing in more fentanyl into our country? The Chinese via the CCP and their CCP financed fentanyl labs, or the Mexican cartels?
That's the key thing here. People aren't understanding the complexity that the American government knows that the Chinese triads with known and proven connections to the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party are the directors and financiers, essentially, of the Mexican cartels, who, of course, everyone knows, the most violent organizations in the world. The Mexican cartels, we can see them as the thug distribution arm, the enforcers. But the Chinese triads, again, set up in Canadian cities with deep ties to financial institutions, they underwrite the fentanyl being trafficked into American cities. And then how it works is the Chinese organized crime has people pick up the cash from those sales. It's warehoused in, grocery stores, underground casinos, massage parlors. Then that cash is, distributed back to the Mexican cartels. It's distributed back to banks in Canada in complex ways. It's distributed back to Chinese fentanyl precursor factories in Wuhan. And that, triggers that flow into America again. So what I want to stress to your viewers, Laura, is that, look, the Latin countries are being used because obviously the corruption there is very known, right? That is, being used as a node to essentially, with fentanyl and immigration, attack America. But people don't quite understand that the northern border, Canada, is like a more sophisticated financial, you could call it, weapon against America. And this has been happening for decades. So I'll just give you 2 data points to let people know this is my reporting, but it's proven. Look, a U.S. congressional report in December said the Mexican cartels should be, of course, sanctioned, but don't forget that the Chinese triads need to be named hand in glove as a partner. Also, Biden Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with a Canadian mayor in 2023 and confirmed these facts. The American government believes China is leveraging fentanyl to kill Americans and cause chaos. And the American government knows that the Latin cartels, the Chinese Communist Party, and these Chinese triads are all working together with the, shared objectives. Everyone's getting something in that evil alliance.
So that brings me to my next question. Do you think that the Trump administration is going too easy on China? Because look, I mean, when President Trump first ran for president, and we saw even during his first term, it was a lot of tough talk about China, 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 China. Yet when you look at the breakdown of these tariffs, you have 25% tariffs for Mexico and 25% tariffs for Canada, but only 10% tariffs for China. And so, do you think that the Chinese are getting a deal here, getting a break? Do you think that the Trump administration is being too soft on China? Do you think that it's time to increase the percentage of tariffs on China to hold them accountable? Because it doesn't really seem like the Chinese have been held accountable for anything, right? They haven't been held accountable for murdering 1.2 million United States citizens with a bioweapon that they unleashed on our country and the entire world. They haven't been held accountable for poisoning Americans, hundreds of thousands of Americans every single year who die from fentanyl poisoning, not including all the people around the world who are also, falling victim and dying at the hands of CCP financed and exported fentanyl that is coming from their CCP finance labs. And also, when you look at all of the, hundreds of millions of dollars that they rip off from American companies every single year, as it relates to knockoff products and these shady imports in places like California, where reports from the United States government show that hundreds of millions of dollars are being robbed from American companies as a result of these, shady Chinese practices. So would you like to see more aggression from the Trump administration as it relates to economic pressure on China? Because a lot of people that I have conversations with seem to think that the Trump administration is going too easy on China, right? That there's not enough punitive damages being exercised against the CCP, and that the relationship is a little too lighthearted. I mean, we see that President Trump even invited Xi Jinping to the inauguration. And of course, he declined to attend the inauguration, but he did send a representative from the CCP. And this shocked a lot of people. A lot of people were wondering, why we allowed a representative from the CCP to attend the inauguration of President Donald Trump. Thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, my thoughts are you nailed it by naming, these fake knockoff goods. The thing is, this is incredibly complex statecraft on the part of the American administration. And by the way, it's been going on for 10 years now. America knows that the supply chains of China are being used against America in complex ways. So when you talk about those knockoffs and, underground, probably illegal labor factory in, California, other states, these knockoffs are part of China's international trade, and they are used to launder fentanyl proceeds around the world. As a quick example, the knockoffs could be sent from California into Mexico to pay for another load of fentanyl coming in, or they could be sent back to China. This is how complex the trade is.
Yeah, and it's no coincidence that most of these knockoffs, according to reports that have been released by not just members of United States Congress, but also by Border Patrol themselves, that is where most of the Chinese illegal aliens are coming in. They're coming in through the border with California and Mexico, and they're also bringing in majority of these illegal goods into the ports in California. They're also coming in through New York as well, and then of course a lot of the illegal alien activity comes in through the border with Canada, of course, again, New York. But the reality is that, this is not, in my opinion, being discussed enough. The focus is too heavy on the activity out of Central America, South America, Mexico, the Mexican border. And you have this whole criminal organization, this whole financing scheme that you have exposed on the northern border. And my question is, why is there such a focus on the southern border? And it seems like such a lack of attention and lack of focus to the CCP activity and the CCP financing on the northern border.
This is absolutely key. Look, what Americans, the thing they should take away from this conversation is America is surrounded, and Canada is part of that surrounding. China has been sending in, massive amounts of operations into Canada for about 40 years now. And as I've said, look, the Canadian banks and real estate are part of the leverage of Chinese illicit financial activity and corruptive activity. And at the end of the day, that's aimed at the United States. Laura, as you know, we're getting sort of closer to war surrounding Taiwan involving Beijing. They've already infiltrated America's, phone systems, America's critical infrastructure. They want to shut down America and stop any response if Taiwan is captured. But this is the key here. Look, this is like the Cuban Missile Crisis, except it's a lot more complex. You're right. People are looking at the illegal immigration coming up in the southern border. And here's the key. Yes, the human trafficking is connected to the fentanyl trafficking, is connected to the corruption, is connected to those illegal trade goods you're talking about. But yes, Canada to the northern border, there's a deep concern in Washington, and it's not just President Trump, that Canada is a vulnerability that will be used against Americans. And that's the problem here. Those tariffs, again, for Canadians, they're unfair, but they're pointing to, I believe, sort of a deeper war strategy that the United States is getting ready to, unfortunately, possibly have to go kinetic with China. And I'll end, by saying this. Look, when we're talking about the Sinaloa cartel, at the end of the day, it should be Chinese organized crime and Chinese communist officials that are able to direct, because they can finance and move the money around the world. So you're right. People should not just be looking at more impoverished Latin American nations. They should be looking at Chinese triads. And I'll give you one example. I have documents that say the country of Belize is owned by Chinese transnational crime. So look, it doesn't get more clear than that. Latin American corruption is deeply tied to the Chinese Communist Party, who can use those states in immigration and drug trafficking.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because when I was in Panama, the first thing that you see when you arrive in Panama is a giant sign that says Bank of China. And I like vacationing in Belize, actually. It's one of my favorite places to visit. And so when I go to Central or South America, and I noticed this when I was in Belize last time, there are so many little like supermarkets, like random pop-up stores that have Chinese lettering. And it's like, why is there just these random Chinese stores? And it goes to what you were talking about, how they have these stores that get popped up, whether they're massage parlors or they're little grocery stores. And I'm not saying that all of them are being used for, laundering drugs or laundering money. But when you go to Central or South America and even the Caribbean, I was in Grenada a few months ago too, the same thing. There's just a lot of Chinese activity and a lot of these islands in the Caribbean, the West Indies and Central and South America. And it's a little bizarre when you're there and everybody's speaking Spanish. And then all of a sudden you just see these huge Chinese communities within these. It's not exactly like a populated area either. These are rural areas.
Absolutely. That's the shocker. Within about the past 10 years, China has essentially, through these, diaspora community economies, which are all connected to underground cash, drug cash being moved around the world. I'm not accusing all the shop owners and all the pedicurists, etc., of being on the take. What I'm saying is China sends in agents and organized crime to infiltrate those communities and use their businesses to move this drug cash around. And you're right. My point here is that, look, during Kennedy, everyone was worried about, Russia moving in to the Latin, areas. Right now, it's China. Very obviously, people need to shift their mindset and see that this is what is confronting the United States. And, like him or hate him, and there's, again, as a Canadian, there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of, feeling of disrespect with some of the language that President Trump is using towards Canada. But he is using language against, people that quite possibly in Canadian government have been captured by these Chinese infiltration networks. So people need to understand that there are big shifts going around the world, and China, at the end of the day, is the enemy, not the Chinese people, the Chinese
Absolutely.
Communist Party.
Well, and your Substack, which I encourage everybody to read, you recently published the Substack article, Canadian Banks Tied to Chinese Fentanyl Laundering Risk U.S. Treasury Sanctions After Cartel Terror Designation. I mean, this is crazy because, President Trump has designated these cartels and all of these, Mexican drug cartels, South American cartels, and South American gangs as being terrorist organizations. And so if you don't mind naming some of these banks, because you may actually find that if you're watching this program tonight, you yourself bank with some of these banking institutions. What are some of the banks that you know of that are involved in financing financing the drug cartel operation via CCP money laundering? And additionally, how could the Treasury or the DOJ escalate pressure on these banks that are facilitating cartel finance? Do you think that we will come to see a time where these Chinese triad leaders and also the executives of these banks are perhaps designated under U.S. terrorism laws as terrorists themselves if they don't start to take the financing seriously?
I believe that's the discussion in Washington right now. I broke stories based on information from Dr. David Asher. He's a former top Trump 1.0 admin investigator with the State Department. And he informed me that the Toronto Dominion Bank, United States branch, as everyone knows, is subject of a $3.1 billion fine. That's a deferred DOJ prosecution. And this is because they were knowingly laundering this Chinese drug cash. And, Dr. Asher told me that the case gets a lot bigger than that 3.1 billion. But by the way, that's the biggest money laundering case in American history, a Canadian bank run out of Toronto. And Dr. Asher told me that, look, the DEA, the DOJ knows that, as the Americans call it, command and control of the Chinese triads using Canadian banks is set up in Toronto. So this American investigation, mostly in the tri-state area, they caught these Chinese gangsters literally carrying basically suitcase level packs of cash into bank branches. And these American gangsters were calling up to Toronto pretty much every day. This indicated that the gangsters with Chinese communist ties in Toronto and Vancouver, where the fentanyl precursors come in, are directing that drug trade. And indeed, it's not just the Chinese gangsters that the US government and Trump administration is concerned with. They are looking at these Canadian financial institution leaders and executives and saying, look, why isn't the Canadian government cracking down? And by the way, Laura, look, Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former Bank of Canada governor, with friends, or rather associates that are heads of these Canadian banks, I do believe in the US Treasury, that is raising some questions.
So do you think that these Chinese triad leaders should be designated as transnational terrorist organizations? Like, do you think that it's time for the Trump administration, and perhaps this would deteriorate our relationship with China? But do you think it's time for the Trump administration to designate the CCP as a terrorist organization?
That's the key. And here's my answer. Look, by designating the Sinaloa cartel, Jalisco as terrorists, because they are, everyone sees, the pits of bodies that they enact. Everyone knows how bloody they are, how savage they are. Everyone knows that tens of thousands of Americans intentionally, we are now saying, being killed. But who is intentional behind that? The Chinese Communist Party sending in the precursors, using the Mexican cartels. So indeed, Dr. David Asher says, look, the facts are that the Chinese triads with connections to Beijing's Communist Party are moving the money. Those loads of fentanyl pills don't come in unless the Chinese triads set up the money laundering. So of course, they should be designated as abettors or facilitators of terror organizations. And that means, here's the key, Laura, Americans will not be able to understand this, but basically Canada has such restrictive laws that it can't even investigate these brutal, murderous cartels set up in Canada. We can't even set up wiretaps on Sinaloa bosses because our sort of laws that favor civil liberties and defense bar that. And that has been a big frustration for the American administration. So look, by designating the cartels, saying that the Chinese triads are actually above them in a way, yeah, you can go after those Chinese triad bosses who, by the way, Laura, I'm not afraid, I'll tell you, have connections to Canadian political leaders. That's part of the election interference story. So what Dr. David Asher is saying, you designate these Chinese triad bosses as connected to terror organizations. Canadian politicians aren't going to be feeling free to meet some of these organized crime bosses at fundraisers anymore. and you can take down the Chinese infiltration networks that have deeply, deeply, deeply embedded in Canada for the past 40 years.
Well, and when I was reading your article, what really struck me too is how, here in the United States, when you think of drug lords, you think of people like El Chapo, right? Like, oh yeah, the most dangerous drug lords in the world are people like El Chapo, and you think of these these gangsters from Mexico or Colombia, or these South American drug lords who are tattooed all over their body, but you actually identified that through your conversation with Mr. Asher that one of the world's most wanted drug lords is a Chinese individual by the name of, and who knows if I'm pronouncing his name right, Chi Lop, who was living in Toronto. Close. And so he was living in Toronto carrying out his operations. And you think to yourself, like if you were to ask the average person, where do you think the most wanted drug lord in the world would come from? They would probably tell you Mexico or Colombia, maybe Venezuela, or maybe El Salvador. You're not thinking that that individual is going to be of Chinese origin, but it is. And they were living in Toronto, right across the border from the United States. I mean, it's not that far to get from Toronto to the United States of America.
That's the whole point. Let me break down a few facts about Seychelles Lup. As Dr. David Asher says, he's living in Canada for a reason, because Canada has these weak laws that cannot go after transnational crime. The most powerful transnational crime, actually not the cartels. The DEA knows Chinese crime is upstream, as they say. They're at the top of the pyramid. They're not killing the most people with guns. They're killing the most people with fentanyl. They're killing the most people with sophisticated money laundering. They're capturing Canadian city real estate, pushing out tax-paying hard workers.
That's a very Maoist mindset too. The idea of killing your enemy without firing a bullet.
Absolutely.
That is a very Maoist concept. And so what people need to understand is that the Maoist concept behind the communist, I mean, look, communism has been very brutal. Obviously, it's resulted in the death of over 100 million people worldwide, right? So I'm not saying that communists are not brutal and that communists don't actually commit real violence, right, with weapons. But the idea behind Maoist global domination is killing your enemy and conquering your enemy without firing a single bullet or having to use physical violence. And so I think that this is a very important concept for people to understand when they're talking about the enemy of the CCP and Chinese infiltration, because people will say, oh, well, how dangerous could it really be? And this is why there's this global misconception about how the Mexican cartels are more violent, or that they're more dangerous than the Chinese communist spy operatives or money launderers who are here in the United States of America, or who are embedded all over, Western governments around the world. They're actually more dangerous because they're the ones that are calling the shots and providing the financing and the operational infrastructure for the violent criminals that are, murdering people point blank and running into supermarkets with, AK-47s or AR-15s and, blowing up hundreds of people.
That's absolutely it. Let me just paint the picture of Seychelles Lup. If people saw this guy, he would look like a bank branch manager or someone, in his younger years across the counter as a bank teller. But he gambled. I'll just give you a few data points. His organization is called The Company. This is a network of all these international communist connected triads. And, he was, again, set up in Toronto. So the biggest Chinese gang boss in the world, living in a Canadian city, connecting, as I know, Canadian police saw his organization meeting with senior Canadian politicians, which is a concern. This guy gambled something like he lost $70 million, something like that, one night in a Macau casino. Casinos are very important to the money laundering operations. His organization, again, Dr. David Asher said, Seychelles Lup is running Western Hemisphere money laundering, command and control from Toronto. That's why he was set up in Canada. Again, he looks like a bank branch manager. He doesn't look like an MS-13, thug on the streets by any means.
And these, to your point and what you were saying earlier, these are not just outcast individuals. These individuals have been, you said, caught on camera or under surveillance while they've been under surveillance meeting with Canadian officials, including the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau?
That's right. A shocking story. Actually, I broke this story in my book, Willful Blindness. We can find, again, it's interesting because these individuals look like bankers. They're often found meeting with top Canadian politicians, including our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau,
Yeah, they're like
in donation
they're
meetings.
like the jihadis in suits, right? These jihadist Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas officials who are operating 501c3 Islamic charities here in America, and they get invited into the White House by Joe Biden, or they get invited to speak. I mean, for crying out loud, one of them was even invited to give the invocation at the inauguration of President Trump until I exposed it, and he was promptly
That
removed from the program, right? But just like you have jihadis in suits here in America and also in Canada, where Islamification has also become a massive problem. I think that you even had a case of an Islamic terrorist not too long ago who had enough fentanyl, if I'm not mistaken, to poison the entire country of Canada. I believe there was a story several years ago of an Islamic individual. I think it was in Canada, and he walked down some very populated area where people were hanging out at a cafe, killed a bunch of people, and then the investigation found that the individual and his brother were involved in fentanyl production and fentanyl transportation. I'll have to look this up, but I do remember a story out of Canada like that several years ago.
I vaguely remember that, but I can tell you that absolutely in that same Toronto area, we know because I've reported that there are top Iranian Hezbollah linked operatives. They run financial institutions. And we learned because a top Canadian intelligence official was compromised by them that these people were laundering. I know one that the Americans investigated very deeply in Toronto, laundering billions of dollars through big Canadian banks. This is connected to the Iranian regime. And Laura, my work has shown that Hezbollah has connections to the Mexican cartels and the money laundering networks connect to China. And let me just bring it back. They're speaking about Justin Trudeau meeting known Western Hemisphere boss gangsters. Yes, my work showed that that is Justin Trudeau, the former prime minister, was captured in RCMP surveillance in Vancouver while the RCMP Canadian police doing the biggest ever international money laundering investigation. They found Mr. Trudeau in a private hotel room with a top gang boss named Paul King Jin and another, very senior figure from the Chinese military. And so my sources said in a story, it raises deep concerns that Mr. Trudeau is meeting with billion-dollar level organized crime suspects. No one, as my source said, is accusing Mr. Trudeau of being on the take or corrupt, but we would be naive to think that billion-dollar Chinese gangsters with connections to Beijing aren't trying to secure some kind of influence. What kind of influence could they be trying to secure? I'm not exactly sure, but could it relate to donation meetings? It sure pops in my mind that we just had a Chinese Canadian politician from Justin Trudeau's party step down at midnight last night for allegedly counseling, his political rival to be delivered to a Chinese consulate for a bounty. Incredible stuff. It's almost like a dream here in Canada. But again, let me bring it back. To an extent, I do think this is what the Trump administration is concerned with, and perhaps even why President Trump has been so disrespectful in his comments to Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, and another thing that I found interesting from your reporting about this individual who met with Justin Trudeau is that he was deported from Panama for using a false ID. And as I said, when I was in Panama, when I was in the Darien Gap, I noticed that the first thing you see when you get to Panama, which is also being controlled by China now, which is why President Trump wants to take back control of the Panama Canal, because the Chinese have basically taken over the Panama Canal. The first thing you see is a giant sign that says Bank of China. And when I was visiting all the different migrant camps, they actually have their own entire Chinese migrant camp called San Vicente, where they have WeChat centers and they have these pop-up. I mean, it's incredible. Literally in the jungle of Panama, you have these little huts that have full Chinese supplies stocked almost like a Chinese supermarket in the middle of an indigenous village for the Embara Indian people. I have this all on video. It's
Incredible.
totally shocking. But it's interesting that he was deported from Panama because it shows you that this drug kingpin who was living in Toronto, who is one of the most wanted, I guess you're saying drug traffickers financed by the CCP, who's meeting with Justin Trudeau. Shockingly, right? They are traveling back and forth to Central and Latin America, South America, which should be a dead giveaway that the Chinese are the main financiers of the illicit, not just, I would say, illegal alien human trafficking operation that is, headed into the United States of America, but also the drug trafficking. And this goes to what you said about the massage parlors. I think it's really weird how you see all these Asian massage parlors. And again, I'm not accusing every single one of these people of being involved in drug trades or human trafficking. But I have always wondered how these pop-up massage parlors that seem to get no activity whatsoever, you see like one person go in there all day long and they have 10 people inside waiting to work. It's like, okay, how do you guys, pay your bills? How do you pay for rent? And it's something that always pops up in the back of my mind. It's like, how do these massage parlors stay in business? They get like one client a day sometimes. And you have like 50 of them on a street corner.
A person with sharp eyes can see that. And it's amazing when you step back. A few years later, you read intelligence reports, and I'm speaking of myself now. It's absolutely strategic that diaspora communities pop up. And again, most people there probably, running away from the thuggish regime. But the pop-up of these businesses is related to China implanting economies around the world and weaponizing them, again, against democracies. And, let me just say, this gangster that was meeting with Justin Trudeau, he's from Vancouver. I've tracked him, in flights to Mexico. I like to connect the dots. At a border check, he was found with the card of a U.S. sanctioned high-level Chinese diplomat gangster named Broken Tooth Koi. Always colorful stuff here. And yes, he also flew to Panama. Of course, very important, Marco Rubio focusing on how Chinese businessmen are so deeply invested in Panama now. But this gangster that met with Justin Trudeau kicked out there.
It's funny because I was speaking with Marco Rubio about this, and when I did my reporting on this, and President Trump, of course, utilized my reporting in his decision when it came to the selection of his ambassador to Panama, who is still awaiting his confirmation hearing, Kevin Cabrera, and he called me. President Trump actually called me when I returned from the Darien Gap, and I had said, when you win the election, what you should do is you should take back the Panama Canal. And I'm not saying that I'm the only person who recommended this idea to President Trump, but I do know that my reporting was essential in President Trump's conversations with Marco Rubio as it related to cracking down on the CCP influence within Panama, the Panama Canal, and also having discussions to shut down the Darien Gap. You have to shut down the Darien Gap if you want to gain control over the Chinese human trafficking and drug trade operation that is going through the Darien Gap within these in these migrant camps. And somebody who's done a phenomenal job documenting this through his own reporting too is an independent reporter by the name of, and war correspondent by the name of Michael Young. I don't know if you're familiar with his reporting,
I am, yes.
But he does a lot to track these operations within Central South America and all over the world. Really, he has one of the most extensive databases, I would say, tracking these diaspora communities and the CCP pop-ups in, he travels all over the world documenting this. Crazy. The places that he goes to document the CCP infiltration. But that leads me to my next question then. You hinted at the triads being designated or held accountable and charged for terrorist activity. But do you think that we will actually see the day when the Trump administration or the United States government just finally designates the CCP as a whole? I'm not talking about like individual drug kingpins or individuals who are involved in, the fentanyl financing or human trafficking or fentanyl transportation. Do you think that it will officially be the policy of the United States of America that the CCP itself, which would then mean that we would have to, finagle or renegotiate how we do business with China, especially given the fact that so much of our manufacturing is taking place in China? Do you think we'll ever see the day where the CCP is designated as a terrorist organization?
Well, I really do think at the end of the day, that's the only solution, because let me step back. We're talking about how, communities of humans, people, good people around the world are being thuggishly controlled and weaponized against other states. It's just unacceptable. And by the way, China, in a very racist way, says, even if you're, an immigrant in another country, you should be loyal to the Chinese, they call him the Yellow Emperor in their racist language. So look, that's got to stop. This is not about Chinese people. It's about that thuggish, hostile regime. And yes, look,
well,
already.
And to that point, that is why I was so critical of the appointment of Alex Wong, who is a Chinese individual. His wife is also Chinese. Her father, who is now dead, Alex Wong's father-in-law, was the one of the managing directors of AsiaSat and the fourth largest shareholder in AsiaSat, which is the premier satellite provider for China, which does work with the CCP and the People's Liberation Army in China. And so our deputy national security advisor, who works underneath Michael Waltz, who was appointed by President Donald Trump, who also serves as an assistant to the President of the United States, is a Chinese individual by the name of Alex Wong, and his wife is also Chinese. I'm not saying all Chinese people are loyal to the CCP, but a lot of people don't really understand that you could have somebody who looks like a banker, they look like they're, loyal to the country that they're living in. They could pretend that they are, completely unaffiliated with the CCP, but they are highly conditioned and highly trained to have a loyalty, whether or not they lie to your face and tell you that they hate Xi Jinping, that they hate the CCP, to have this loyal to the emperor, as you said. And so it's a Maoist tactic. It's a Maoist tactic, and there's a lot that goes into training these individuals to infiltrate governments at the highest level. And you would think that somebody is completely anti-CCP and that their loyalty is to the government that they're residing in, but they could be operating as a spy or an operative for the CCP. And some people will say, oh, it's so racist. You can't say that. You can't say that these people have due loyalty or singular loyalty to the CCP, but it is something that happens more often than not. It's often buried in intelligence reports. They just had a case a couple days ago that I tweeted about where a professor who was receiving millions of dollars in funding and had all these top secret clearances to work on all these top secret projects with the United States government was just found to be an operative for the CCP, even though he had publicly said that he didn't have an allegiance to the CCP. I believe this was out of New York. And I tweeted about it the other day, and the FBI raided his home, and he had received millions of dollars of financing in federal grants from our government.
Well, that's the key thing here. It's called the United Front Work Department. It works under Xi Jinping. He literally calls it a magic weapon. And Laura, this is so important. The Chinese people, humans, are controlled by Xi Jinping with the United Front Work Department. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is conspiracy fact. So you said designation. Yes, that congressional report I talked about in December suggests United Front community associations should be designated and banned in the United States. And what's the evidence here? You mentioned New York. Look, there's a staffer named Linda Sun, worked for 2 Democratic governors. She was writing speeches for them. She and her family earned millions in clandestine payments from the United Front Work Department. She was blocking engagement with our ally Taiwan. And that's what it's all about. It's about how Beijing tries to implant its agents through the United Front. And by the way, it's a carrot and a stick. They're bribed and they're threatened. They can have family members in China who will live under fear. If China has these agents in the United States, it can leverage them. So yeah, the Communist Party needs to be designated in some way so we can get back to when we welcome immigrants into North America, they're all on an even level. They're not leveraged by the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I mixed it up. This one was out of Indiana. The case out of New York City was the CCP police stations that people are now growing outraged over, because the CCP in Chinatown and a lot of these very Chinese heavy areas in New York City, they have their own police stations where they're turning people in to the CCP. And so the case that I was talking about was FBI and Homeland Security agents searched the house in Bloomington, Indiana, of an individual by the name of Xiaofeng Wang, who was a cryptography professor at Indiana University, and he worked with the DNI in Intelligence Advanced Research Projects on highly sensitive cybersecurity research, and he was found to be a Chinese communist asset. He was raided by the FBI, and he was the co-director of the Center for Distributed Confidential Computing, a project funded by the National Science Foundation. He received over $23 million in grant money from the United States government. And so, again, it's outrageous. And you think to yourself, how many professors like this, how many bankers, how many politicians, how many aides? We saw that Dianne Feinstein, who was a United States Senator for 20 years, she had a CCP agent, a CCP spy as her driver. Kathy Hochul's chief of staff turned out to be an operative, a spy for the CCP. So
yeah, that's it. All through the United Front. It's a total, as Pompeo said, the enemy is inside our gates, and the CCP needs to be designated again. So like humans cannot be leveraged by the Beijing trying to undermine and take over the United States, essentially at the end of the day. And as I say, Canada, unfortunately, being weaponized at this point through that infiltration.
I know you have to go soon. So in closing, what does this mean for the future of Canada, and what does this mean for the future of the United States of America, and how important are these issues, and how important is the topic of CCP election interference and CCP infiltration of Canada's financial markets to the upcoming April 28th elections in Canada? We see that tomorrow is going to be Liberation Day, as President Trump calls it, as it relates to the implementation of the auto tariffs on Canada. But how important is this topic of CCP infiltration to the overall issues of electing a new prime minister on April 28th?
Well, it's everything. Canadian intelligence reports said that over the past 10 years, Justin Trudeau's government needed to pay attention to China's deep interference that's been leveraged up under Xi Jinping with his magic weapon, the United Front. If Canada didn't respond, we face a sovereignty concern. We face existential, the concerns about the future of our government, of our democracy. And the thing is that Justin Trudeau didn't act. That's the core of the stories that I broke. Perhaps, that had some part in Mr. Trudeau having to step down. So the question here is Mark Carney the right person to replace him and take any action against Beijing? And the evidence says no. Mr. Carney was supportive of this Liberal MP and candidate who suggested delivering a Canadian to the Chinese consulate. Mr. Carney, through running a major investment fund, Brookfield, took a $300 million loan from the Bank of China, had major investments within China, $3 billion in commercial real estate, I reported. So to me, it looks like Mr. Carney, through his international banking connections, his deep trade ties to China, his relationship directly with Xi Jinping, is not the right leader for Canada coming up. The Conservative opposition is much more ready, I believe, to enact sort of the legal reforms that would be able to go after the cartels and the triads, would actually be able to stop fentanyl from killing not at least start to get those death numbers down in Canada and hopefully the United States as a result of that. So it's hugely important. And, not it's not just Canada. I think you would probably agree, Laura. We only see the tip of the iceberg in terms of China's infiltration into American politics. And my reporting, hopefully, increasingly will help, focus on United States and how the China's United Front has just insidiously filtered into American politics.
So, what can Americans do, and what can President Trump do in these next 3 weeks before your election to make sure that the interim Prime Minister Mark Carney does not hold another term?
Well, I mean, we need to be careful that we're not suggesting that President Trump or Americans interfere in Canada, just as we wouldn't want China to interfere.
Right.
At the same
Not
time,
interfering, but raising awareness about this, because people do have a lot of friends and they have family members who live in Canada, and it's not election interference to raise awareness about the CCP financing and the fentanyl operation that is killing people, not just in Canada, but also here in the United States. This is directly impacting us. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's unfounded election interference from a foreign nation. It really is our foreign policy, and it's going to be pivotal to how we have ongoing relations with Canada. Because if they continue to stand by, let's just say that Mark Carney does win, if they continue to stand by and allow for the CCP to infiltrate our country and to infiltrate the finance institutions and keep poisoning Americans and Canadians, well, that's going to have a serious national security impact here in the United States of America. And it could lead to increased tariffs for the Canadian people. So it's in their best interest to take this information and to educate their peers and make a better decision come April 28th if they don't want to be punished by these tariffs.
that is my message. So if I was speaking directly to President Trump, I would say, President Trump, we know, or some Canadians know, you had a bad relationship with Justin Trudeau because Justin Trudeau was untrustworthy. Justin Trudeau and his party were infiltrated by the Chinese communists. Everyone in Canadian intelligence knows this. So I would say, President Trump, tell Canadians you deeply respect Canada as a partner, a strong ally in the World War II, a strong ally after 9/11. We want Canada as one of the strongest democratic nations, a superpower to stand beside America. We respect you. We have a concern that China has saturated your institutions. Canadians, stand beside us in Washington. Elect a government that will treat China and the Communist Party as the enemy it is. Make sure your financial institutions are cleaned up. Make sure that your children can afford to live in Canadian cities that aren't being pumped up with laundered Chinese drug money. Canada, President Trump, please say this to the Canadians. You respect Canada. You hope Canada will strengthen its military and stand with its true brother, sister, cousin, ally, the United States. That's what we need to hear in Canada.
Absolutely, because I bet that President Trump, just like he wants to have a America First policy here, I'm sure that he also wants to see Canada be Canada first.
We're stronger together. Absolutely. We can't be divided. Americans and Canadians are so close. We're basically the same in a lot of ways. And yet Canada is strong and sovereign. Look, who knows? Maybe I'll go into politics someday. I want to stay Canadian and I want to be best friends with the United States. That's what I'd say to President Trump right now.
Absolutely. Well, Sam, congratulations on all of your reporting successes and shaking up the Canadian elections with your intrepid investigations. I know that you're the founder of the Bureau, which is on Substack. Where do people go to read your work, support your work, and follow you on social media so that they can follow the CCP infiltration and the heated discussions around the upcoming Canadian elections?
Yeah. So I am the founder of the Bureau.news, and I'll just do the plug for my book, Willful Blindness. Look, this is the book that's being read by the CIA. It's being read by US Treasury. It's being read in Taiwan. This is the book that told the story. Look, see those fentanyl pills going around the world, Canada being used. So you can read that book, go to Amazon to find Willful Blindness, and go to the Bureau.news. This is one of the new leading independent investigative platforms in the world. And I'll be reporting much more on the United States in the coming weeks and months.
Can you send me a signed copy?
Absolutely. We'll work on that within the day.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to reading your book because I find this to be, incredibly fascinating. And I think that more people really need to, shift their focus as it relates to what the real threat is. Because there's, in my opinion, a very surface level understanding of the threats as it relates to the border crisis, the drug crisis, and the trade crisis that our country is experiencing. So, Sam, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you coming on.
Great. I really like following your work, and so good to meet.
You too. Thank you.